podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Welcome back, everyone.
Hey.
I hope you enjoyed your lunch date and actually talked to another person about your ideas and got in touch with somebody else.
Yes.
Welcome back. All right. I would like to proceed with the process that we're in right now by talking a little bit more about prototyping. And I briefly, again, wanted to mention, okay, so we have now covered all of this. How might we? Ideation, and now we thought about, what could be one idea that we want to stick with, that we actually want to deliver to some extent. And this is where prototyping comes into the game. Sorry. Okay. Because prototyping, and we have done that in the first warm-up exercise yesterday, where you were actually supposed to prototype something with the tools and materials that you have at hand, is one of my favorite techniques when it comes to creating a kind of experience in terms of our innovation. And you might recall yesterday that we talked about the lean startup as an approach by Eric Ries. And just to make you understand the connection again, I have this very helpful diagram or process. Okay, so what we've done in terms of design thinking was this. Okay, kind of the double diamond here. I can really draw beautifully. And what happens then? So this is kind of the problem space. Okay, so we want to understand the problem, we want to understand the user of our problem, and then approach that problem with a particular idea. What happens now is that we enter another phase, which is called prototyping phase. And now we are in that wheel that I mentioned before of building something, testing it, and then learning from it. Okay, so we now enter the solution space. Now what happens is, so I mentioned this already, so this is kind of iterative. Okay, so you have to do it all the time. And what happens if you understand that something that you built is totally off because your idea is, totally wrong with the problem that you want to solve, what you obviously have to do is go back, right, to any of these phases and go through them again. And this is kind of what's called iterative or agile thinking, and this is a way of how this is done in design thinking and lean startup. Oh, hold on. Yeah, you've seen that. Hello, welcome back, everyone. Welcome to Prototyping 101. And the basic idea of prototyping is not only, as I mentioned yesterday, that you have a better understanding of as your team, what your idea actually is, because they could be still, you could still have different and divergent understandings of what your actual idea is. And the main reason why you do prototyping is that you get a grip of your hypothesis and falsify or verify them. Okay, I will have a sentence about this in a second, but the basic understanding of prototyping is, as I mentioned just now, is that you map first your hypothesis that you have, and then build a prototype that helps you to verify or falsify that. Okay, I just repeated myself. Just to make it clear, because I think it's very important. Okay, so what I have here is how you can do this. Okay, so the hypothesis so this was part of a kind of alcohol beverage design innovation thing. And here the hypothesis was this. Okay, so we believe that people will be happy to share their rare scotch with others. And how will they do that? They will test this by interviewing 30 people outside a liquor store. And then you define what is the criteria that if the hypothesis has been verified or falsified, and it says we are right if more than 70% of people say they like the idea of Scotch Finder. Is that clear how this works?
In theory.
In theory, right. Okay, if you understand it in theory, then you can get to the second stage and ask yourself, what is wrong with these hypotheses and the way that is phrased? How can we improve that? After everything you've learned so far.
Because we didn't base it on the users in the first time.
Exactly. So in this sentence, we believe that people, who's people, right? But in design thinking, you would say it's a concrete person, right? So we believe that Tim, who drinks alcohol once a week with his friends, will be happy to share a rare scotch with others. Okay, so we would make it more concrete in that term, because it's not a scientific methodology right here, right? We basically want to test or see what kind of users are there and how we, reach them basically. Is there anything else that could be improved about the formulation of these hypotheses and the way it's being tested?
Well, we need to define what is a rare scotch and what is sharing, and who's sharing with whom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that would be really important to, be more concrete. What does that experience of sharing imply? Is it family? Is it friends? What's the context and so on? What's a rare scotch, etc.
Then interviewing 30 people outside the liquor store. What are you going to ask them exactly and how?
Yeah.
Maybe not say the truth. So we have to find a way of capturing better reality, maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, perfect. Right. So it's not, and this is what I mentioned before or yesterday even, interviewing will not get you, as you mentioned, it doesn't capture reality. So how can we come up with a good experiment, basically? And prototypes are essentially experiments, right? That test our hypothesis. So think of it as kind of these psychological experiments where you send people into a room and then observe them and you try to set up something. Okay, so this is maybe a better way of framing them, these hypotheses. Okay, so we believe that double income, no kids, so DINKAs, couples in high power jobs need a great way to socially share scotch. Okay, so it's more concrete in terms of the target group. It's also a little bit more concrete about how that sharing actually works. And then again, here it says interviewing 30 dinks, so double income, no kids. Even though, as you just mentioned, I think there could be better ways of testing that actually. And then we are right if we find a common scotch related problem shared by several, more than 6 or so of them, which they're currently trying to solve. Okay, so in terms of, is there actually a market for this? Does it make sense, the way that you try to formulate your hypothesis?
Yeah, it makes more sense.
In theory. You will see that in a second, where we actually try to map your hypothesis. Okay. Now, after you've done that, and you will have to do that in a second, so mapping your hypothesis. So think of, as I mentioned, each and every hypothesis as, one way of, or a prototype is one way of, trying to solve that hypothesis or map it. Okay, so a prototype is not like the car manufacturers always think, okay, a prototype is like a billion euro very expensive car that will not get sold. Prototyping as such is more, as I showed you yesterday, a really easy way of experimenting with the assumptions that we have. Okay, so in comparison to the very fancy Mercedes car that probably costs millions of euros to build, a prototype is a tiny experiment that works with little resources and little time. It shouldn't take a lot of time to build a first experiment, a first prototype, to get the data that you actually want. Okay, and it's like essentially about data collection. Okay, so here are some principles of prototyping. There's this quote that I really love in terms of prototyping, which says, the only way to experience an experience is to experience it. Yeah, very redundant, but I love the message. Okay, so instead of showing a prototype or telling about a prototype or kind of the thing that you want to create or whatever you want to do, it's always better to create a surrounding where the user, the tester, actually experience it. the experience that you want him or her to have. Okay, so to give you an example, so if you want, so there's a colleague of mine is doing a lot of prototyping in autonomous driving. Okay, so I don't like that because I think cars are stupid. But what he did is basically, so he looks at the hypothesis because what he realized in his exploration mode or in exploration stage is that one crucial moment for autonomous driving is letting the wheel go, right? So this movement of, I have my steering wheel and then I just let go, and what happens. Okay, so this is a very deep emotional moment because you are afraid, don't know what will happen. Will the AI drive you into a tree or another car and so on? So what they did is basically build a prototype which was kind of driving schools cars, where you have like a steering wheel on the other side, or like cars from I don't know, the UK or so. And what they did is they basically built a little tiny wheel, and the other driver was behind a curtain, and they were driving. And at some point, the driver let go with his hands or her hands, and the other persons kept on driving. Okay, so they simulated the experience of letting go and being in an autonomous car without actually building an autonomous car, which would be really expensive and difficult. Okay, but the premise was always, okay, what will happen in that moment where this person lets go? And instead of telling him, okay, what would you do when you will I will let that go, they try to recreate that experience. Check, there's a question. Is it a critical point in which the car has to make a decision? Either it protects the driver or the surroundings. Also, you mean in terms of if the AI decides? So what do you mean, Anna? With your question? No? Okay, think about it. And I come back to it in a second. Okay, the second principle of prototyping, of good prototyping, is that they are low resolution, which means, again, as the example before, don't waste too much money and time in building like a fancy product, website, I don't know, face mask or whatever, but try to, build it as quickly as possible with the least resources that you have, as long as they kind of create a kind of foundation that helps you test your hypothesis. Okay, so it doesn't have to be a fancy thing that you build in a 3D printer or that you manufacture for half a year. It should be done very, very quickly and easily. The next part, again, is connected to this idea of experience. A good prototype is immersive. Okay, so you kind of forget that it is just a mock-up or a very bad paperclip or whatever, but you really immerse yourself into that experience. But because only then can we be more realistic in terms of what are the people actually doing and reacting to our prototype or solution or innovation. The next one goes again hand in hand with the previous one. So be rapid. It's called rapid prototyping as a technique. So be very quick in terms of trying to come up with these ideas. And then I just realized there are two times actionable, but I think it's really important. Try to build a prototype like a scientific experiment so that it really just tests one assumption. To give you one example, yesterday, I think Peter introduced his first aid toolkit that had, I don't know, 20 different functions. Is that right, Peter? And this will be a bad prototype. Okay, it's great in terms of creativity. It's bad in terms of being actionable, because you would not know, and you're all scientists, so you know how this works. You would not know why this person fell asleep. Was it because of the herbal tea? Was it because of the birds in your ears? Was it because of this and that? So try to be very clean and clear about the experiments that you want to draw or that you want to craft with your prototype. Any questions on this so far?
If we are not talking about a thing, I mean an object,
Mm-hmm.
If it's a service, for instance, how can we build that prototype?
Mm-hmm. I'll show you in a second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Then are there any other questions before I show you some examples and methods? Then I just want to finish this by saying, or by actually citing Reid Hoffman, whose quote I love as well. So he's saying, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product or your prototype, you've launched too late. Okay, and this is really the idea of what the School of Lean Startup has launched. Okay, we're not trying to deliver finished product. So the school that is kind of embracing this idea of permanent iteration and permanent innovation is called permanent beta. Right? There is no alpha version. It's always a beta version. Okay. It always is unfinished because it's always in the process of being improved. Okay, so look at Facebook, look at social media, but also look at, I don't know, cars or bags or whatever. There's no such thing as a final product. It's not like your PhD thesis or your book, where there is actually maybe a final product. Hopefully, I know in my case, as soon as it's published, there's a final case, but you know yourself that it always changes, right? So you could always, change your PhD thesis or your book. And this is kind of the same iterative process or mindset that goes into, crafting these prototypes and services. So let me show you a couple of tools that are out there. As you can see, the basic idea of all of these, like paper mockups or click dummies, is they are not the real thing. Okay, so as I said, they are low resolution, so don't program an entire app or whatever, but start with something like paper mockups, which is basically you just use paper and draw the app or the website that you want to create. Okay, and then you give that to a user, and I'll talk about this more in a second. But it can also be something like a role play. Okay, if you're interested in creating a service, then simply play out how your new service could look like. Okay, so if it's a service about arriving in a different way at the hospital, then you can role play that. Or if you want to innovate how, during COVID-19, you kind of register for unemployment money, then you can also prototype that in a role play, but also in click dummies. So basically mock-ups of the websites that you will have to click on. You can also use sketches, right? So be visual again, just to give your user a possible experience of what it could look like and how, what it would feel like. One of my favorite tools is called Wizard of Oz. I don't know if you've read that book. It's a very old book, kind of old book, and it's actually a spoiler. So I'm sorry if you haven't read it and wanted to read it. But the idea of the Wizard of Oz is there's a wizard and he's very, very powerful apparently. And that's a spoiler now. At the end of the book, it turns out that he can't, do magic at all. But he's just, a little tiny person behind a curtain, and he, was just doing magic or kind of special effects, but he he doesn't have real magic. And the basic principle behind the Wizard of Oz could be, so if you want to, I don't know, we're going to again into the technological direction, but if you want to do a chat bot that helps you, talk to somebody with a mental health disorder who keeps on talking to you. So before actually programming a chatbot, which is kind of complicated and maybe time consuming, what you could do in terms of a Wizard of Oz is you simply open a Facebook page and you open a chat, and you in the beginning first simply write or kind of chat with that person. Okay, so you're basically simulating what the end product could be at some point, without going to all of that production cost and technical skill that you need to actually build like a chatbot. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yes. Let me show you some examples. Okay, so this was one team of my innovation teams that was working in the field of how can we reduce plastic, and they were focusing on consumer behavior and wanted to look for alternatives for to-go food and to-go packaging. So in one sprint phase, they were looking at, okay, what could be different shapes and formats of one of these to-go boxes that could work. Okay, so this was one hypothesis that they have. So people care about the size or the form of that packaging of to-go. So they simply use different already existing, Tupperware and like wooden balls, and they could test with different users about colors, about materials, size, and so on. Another team that wanted to reduce plastic waste, packaging waste in delivery. They basically wanted to get rid of all the Amazon cartonages. They basically thought of creating a smart box for delivery. And what they did, so after they prototyped or came up with different solutions on the size and shape and material of the box, they wanted to prototype, okay, what would it look like if it would be a smart box? Okay, so all they did, instead of programming and hacking and building actually an interface, they simply used an iPhone. Okay, created a PDF with different like pages, and every page was like one click of the customer, and this is what the prototype looked like. The same team also thought, okay, how does the user journey look like? And I'm sorry, that's in German. So what would be the process of ordering something online and then trying to think about how the box gets to that particular person so that they can use it and send it and so on. So going through all of these processes. Another team, which I thought was really clever, they were working on this problem of space in urban cities, and they were trying to get a grip of this understanding of how flexible are people in terms of co-working. So would they need like a fancy co-working space where they share like a desk and have drinks and fruit and so on, or would they also be comfortable in a very tiny space? So these are actually two pictures. So one was kind of like a very fancy office room, and the other one was an elevator. Okay, it was very tiny and very uncomfortable, but they basically wanted to test, okay, how do people interact in these different kinds of surroundings? You can also use something like this. So there's a paper prototype for a backpack that you can use. This is something. So this would be paper mock-ups for a web application or for an app, for example. So instead of going through all of that effort and energy and resources of programming that or whatever, you can basically use Post-its for that. Okay, so where would you put like a button? What could be next, and so on? Where would you print something or type something and so on? Any questions so far? Okay, this is another way of doing these app paper mockups. Okay, so every screen is basically one way of, or kind of one touch of your application. And this is really helpful because on the one hand, you get a visual understanding of it, and at the same time, what you actually have to program and what is kind of superfluous, because maybe some of that you don't actually need. Okay, let me just quickly go back because I wanted to mention a couple of other, actually two other techniques. So one technique that I also really like in terms of prototyping is a press release. Okay, so maybe if you know what press releases are, so kind of a statement from an organization to the press or to the public and so on. And press releases are something that Amazon actually uses. So when they go through an innovation process, they also use design thinking, but they do it the other way around. So they start with a press release where they're basically writing down okay, what would be a press release as soon as our product was successful? Okay, what would the society look like when our product has, has reached launch or has reached, a couple of people? So what's interesting about this is that you basically have to imagine the world with your product or your service, or having solved the problem that you want to tackle. So what would the world look like, and what would be the press release that you would send out from, from the future, basically? And then they call it working backwards. Then they go, from that goal, from the press release, they go through a classical design thinking process. And the final prototyping tool that I wanted to mention, because there have been some issue or some questions about, how can we integrate that into this idea of One Health, is also a systems maps. So maybe you've seen that before. Sorry. Right. So a systems map, like this one, for example, also helps you to kind of prototype the assumptions that you have. Right. So we'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow, because one of the, I think, problems of design thinking to some extent is that it's very human-centered and it's very service or product-centered. Okay, but according to the One Health approach, you would have to, think about the different repercussions that one approach has in terms of, how does that affect the ecosphere? How does it affect kind of animals, plants, and so on? And this is one of the, I would say, basically the deficiencies of design thinking. And something like a systems map can help you by understanding the connections and interconnections between your solution, but also in terms of the problem. So, I mean, one very, very obvious example would be, okay, what happens if, we create a new breathing mask for COVID-19? Okay, what materials does it use? What happens to all the waste that is being generated, which is, one question that is being discussed right now. Okay, what happens to all, the plastic waste of the breathing mask and so on? What are the repercussions of that? And one of these systems maps, and I wanted to show you one tool that you can use. Okay, so for one thing, this is another tool that you can use that helps you design kind of prototyping on a very basic level, kind of apps for different applications, so that you can see it. And maybe I don't know if you've seen that before. It's called Kumu, and this helps you to map a system. It's for free for one map, so you can just join that for free. But the basic idea is that you can here get a better understanding of systemic interrelationships between different interventions, organizations, individuals, and so on. All right, so for example, the Gates Foundation has done a systems map, which is interesting. So this is also a great way of, making people understand, on the one hand, the complexity of the problem, but also making them aware of, what would be the solution that you actually go for.